Welcome to Love for the Truth Radio, a program devoted to encouraging you to be a contender of the faith in an ever-changing church culture. On Love for the Truth Radio, we will discuss current issues and challenging views along with biblical truth that can affect our Christian worldview and how we live out our faith. And now, here's your host, Cindy Hartline.
Welcome to the program. You know, all eyes continue to be on Israel and her affairs as they depict the prophetic signs that we are indeed living in the last days and that Jesus' return is imminent. In 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-4, it reads, "But of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in the darkness, that the day should overtake you as a thief." Peace and safety has been Israel's quest, particularly since she became a nation in 1948. As a result, her Arab neighbors and other nations continue to threaten her with war. We need to keep watch on Israel, for her peace and safety is a sign. Will Israel's two-state solution even bring peace? Will Benjamin Natanyahu be made to step down from his position as prime minister? Is U.S. President Trump's alignment with Netanyahu setting the stage for even more disputes and imminent war? These questions and more will be answered by our guest, Jim Fletcher. Jim is a writer, researcher, speaker, and director of Prophecy Matters. He is also a member of the executive committee of the National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel and author of It's the End of the World as You Know It, and I Feel Fine. He writes online for WorldNet Daily, BeliefNet, American Family Association, the Jerusalem Post, and Rapture Ready. Welcome, Jim Fletcher. It's such a pleasure to have you again on Love for the Truth Radio.
Thank you, Cindy. It's great to be with you.
Jim, you know, there has been some pressing issues about Benjamin Natanyahu being asked to step down from his position. I know that the Israeli former police commissioner, Asaf, I'm not sure how you say his last name, I think it's Hefetz, said that there is sufficient evidence to indict the prime minister on criminal charges in 2 corruption cases. What do you know about these cases and charges?
Well, this isn't the first time that Netanyahu has been investigated like this. I mean, the 2 different times that he's been prime minister, the first time in the 90s, and now the last better part of a decade, his political enemies constantly attack him in this way. Now, the corruption charges, I don't think are really legitimate. I don't think that, for one thing, that it's not been proven that he gained anything from any, deals that he might have cut with anyone. But what we're seeing is a similar thing that's going on here in the United States, where President Trump's political enemies are hounding him with this Russia probe. In much the same way, Netanyahu is being hounded by Israeli media, which is left-wing for the most part, and his political enemies. So I don't think there's a lot to the charges. In fact, Carolyn Glick recently wrote a column about this where she really refuted the charges against him. It's a good read. Now, having said that, that's not to say that he won't be indicted. I don't know what the Attorney General might decide. I do know that the police have recommended that he be indicted. So we're in a period of waiting for a few weeks or even perhaps a few months until the Attorney General makes a decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll tell you what, if he is asked to step down, I think we're in big trouble. But I do know that, from what I understand, now that he is in the hands of the Attorney General, which is Avichai Mandelblit, he is a former Netanyahu ally. And so to decide whether to indict the prime minister, I would say that because he does know him, that maybe he will not be indicted. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's a legitimate thing to think. Israel is such a small country that to some degree everybody does know everybody, and so a lot of these political people have a long history with each other. For example, they may have served in the military together, or they may have come up through the ranks of the Likud party years ago. I do know that Mandelblit, there's an interesting thing about him. His father was a member of the Irgun, which, some people consider them a terrorist group, but in the 40s, that was the group that was fighting the British and the Arabs in Mandate Palestine. My point in all that is Mandelblit comes from a family that is conservative, that is Zionist to the core. He himself is Orthodox Jew. And so that coupled with the fact that, yes, he and Netanyahu go way back, one can speculate that he will choose not to, indict Netanyahu. As I said before, Netanyahu has escaped charges like this before. There's really no reason to believe that he won't again. But again, we have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I mean, just the fact that Mandelblit is a conservative, it gives us more of a promising answer to that, But like you said, it's very interesting that there is a similarity between Trump and Bibi concerning these continuous accusations from their patriotic opponents. And I just want, if you can, Jim, if you can parallel some of the similarities, because I don't know if this is a left-right issue, political issue, because we have the same thing happening here in America, that the left or the liberals are rising up against Trump, just as the left or the liberals are rising up against Netanyahu. But can you parallel some of the similarities between the two?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, the two men have known each other for decades. I mean, they go way back. They're I think, would consider the other a good friend. Both are very successful businessmen, of course. That's one thing that not a lot of people know about Netanyahu. He has a business background, and while most of his adult life has been in politics, he's really one of the driving forces behind Israel's economy booming. So there are those similarities. Each man loves his country deeply, and I think would embrace, traditional values. Each one, I believe, genuinely wants what's best for the country going forward, their respective countries. And so now that leads to their political enemies rising up against them, as we were discussing a minute ago. The media in Israel is very left-wing, perhaps not more so than in the United States. They're both very similar. I mean, an Israeli newspaper or TV station would be every bit as left-wing as CNN or MSNBC here. And so it follows that if a man like that is in power, then those enemies will continually go after him. So the parallels between Trump and Netanyahu are striking and many.
Yeah, it seems that way. Definitely, it seems that way. Now, in your opinion, do you think that Trump's favoritism towards Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel can cause an even greater global uproar? I mean, in our eyes, we think I think it's such a great thing, because I believe that if we are in favor, of course, what the Bible says, with Israel, then God would bless the countries who are. And I feel that we're in a much better position than under the Obama administration. But by the same token, a lot of people are saying, well, because of his favoritism towards Bibi and Israel, that there can be a greater global uproar and even cause war.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting observation, and I think that there's some validity to that. I mean, what we have, I think, going on in the world today is both good and evil are becoming stronger.
Yes.
I mean, there seems to be some sort of showdown coming, so to speak. And so, while there are a lot of good things going on with a Trump and Netanyahu alliance, it also does cause their enemies to double down, to become more entrenched in their hatred of Israel and America.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's going on. Now, the positive thing that I see is that Trump has brought American power back to the forefront. Mm-hmm. We were so weak under Obama globally, and that's now all reversed. Mm-hmm. Now, the real advantage there is that I think that will bolster security for both America and Israel, at least in the short term. So, mm-hmm. And you also have to remember that rarely do we see a true conservative president in office at the same time that a Netanyahu type is in office in Israel. You'll either have, for example, Netanyahu was first elected prime minister in the mid-'90s. Bill Clinton was the president then.
Yeah.
Or then you'll have, the reverse, where you'll have a strong Israeli leader like Netanyahu, and then you'll have an Obama in the White House. So the historical moment we're in is really interesting for the fact that both leaders of these countries are strong conservatives.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know, like we had mentioned, the spiritual war that's going on. Again, I feel like we're in better hands having, in favor of Netanyahu and Israel. Our president being in favor of Israel and Netanyahu. I just feel like we're in better hands, with God, that we would have more of a favor on our country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think so.
Yeah,
I do. The fact is that at the very least, it feels like we've gotten some kind of reprieve.
Yes.
That things are becoming so dark under Obama's tenure that I think people thought the country was lost, and now it's sort of reversed.
Yes.
And so, yes. But at the same time, the spiritual warfare is it is absolutely going on, and I think it's intensifying.
Yeah, it is intensifying. What I think is very unusual, though, talking to people like Amir Sarfati, who is in Israel, he lives in Israel, and hearing that there's so much peace, even though there's war around them. And there's all kinds of rumors of wars and threats and everything. It just seems like that in Israel there's peace. Now, I've never been there, but a lot of friends that have been there have said the same thing, that you don't feel like anything's really going on while you're there, which I see it as the hand of God. And I hear you, though, like you were saying that when Obama was, president, it just seemed like there was a foreboding of some kind that something was going to happen, something was going to take place. And a lot of people were talking about leaving the country because it was getting so hard. It was just in discernment. You could just feel, I have to say, the spirit of the Antichrist. You can just feel that rise going up. But anyway, we're going on a break. Please stay tuned. We will be back with Jim Fletcher.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned.
If you're a first-time listener, you'll find that on Love for the Truth Radio, we discuss news and views from a biblical worldview. We believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God and the absolute truth that should be applied to every aspect of life. We don't proclaim to have a cap on the truth, but we do have a love for biblical truth. So please, take everything you hear on this radio program to study and prayer, And thank you for listening to Love for the Truth Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host for Love for the Truth Radio. We're keeping an eye on Israel to determine our biblical end-time timeline. With us is expert on the subject and guest Jim Fletcher. Jim is the director of Prophecy Matters. You can check out his website, prophecymatters.com. That's prophecymatters.com. Jim, why are Christians more than ever interested in the fate of Israel?
Well, I think for one thing, it's a story that's too big to ignore. The miraculous nature of the founding of the State of Israel now, almost 70 years ago, is something that a lot of people want to talk about. And so even Christians in this country, for example, who maybe aren't all that enamored of Israel, still have some interest because everybody's talking about it. Mm-hmm. Even the people who deny the prophecies or want to minimize the prophecies, I think really underneath it all, they recognize that they're legitimate. And so Israel is just an overall fascinating topic. We have a kind of an odd situation now where in the last several years, probably the last 10 years, there's been a rise of certain evangelical leaders in this country who, in my opinion, are becoming more pro-Palestinian, or at least they're advancing the Palestinian narrative. And so that's also driving interest in the topic. So we have kind of a divide going on between pro-Israel Christians and Christians who are not necessarily on Israel's side. So that's also driving the conversation right now.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think? Why do you think that there are Christians that are advancing the Palestinian agenda, or that are not on Israel's side? I mean, I would think it would be because of wrong doctrine or liberal thought.
But yes, you hit on one of the two answers that I would give. I think that basically there are two reasons for this. One is what you mentioned. For at least 100 years in this country, the seminaries have really been damaging as far as training pastors and that sort of thing, because a lot of the seminary professors themselves either are not believers, or they are so liberal in their thinking that they want to relegate the Bible to myth or that sort of thing. So that's one answer. It's just been a steady diet of wrong doctrinal thinking, a wrong emphasis on biblical interpretation. But the other answer is one that when I give it, people think I'm being harsh, but I say that it's been my experience over the years that a lot of times when you meet a Christian who is either very indifferent toward Israel or hostile, it's because they don't like Jews. Mm-hmm. They simply don't like Jewish people. They've either had a negative encounter with a Jewish person, or more likely they were raised on hearing about Jewish stereotypes and anti-Semitic thought. So that second reason is the more serious one, in my view, but I stand by it because I've seen it too many times, where when you get to the root of the problem, the issue is that the person or persons simply don't like Jewish people. Now, of course, they're not going to, broadcast that, but when you have conversations with them, that kind of thing comes out.
It's interesting how even today we don't talk about prophecy in our churches. You have the liberal thought that has infiltrated our churches. And like you said, the seminaries have become very liberal. And it almost sounds like a political statement. If you're conservative, you're a Christian. If you're liberal, you're not. But by the same token, a lot of the conservative views are the ones that uphold the Lord's statutes and ordinances as we know them. And so that's why we're seeing that. But, I was thinking that the reason why we should be interested in the fate of Israel is because the Bible tells us that Israel becoming a nation will be one of the major signs. And can you give us just at least a brief history of Israel becoming a nation?
Sure. Well, there are just so many prophecies in the Old Testament that point to the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral land after a very long time of them being gone. The biblical view is that they would eventually be expelled from the country for various reasons, and then after a long time of dispersal around the world, that the Lord would bring them back. Now, those verses in the Old Testament are almost all of them are very clear. But again, it depends on how you want to, as an individual, read them. And if a person wants to reject that, he will. But nevertheless, those prophecies are very numerous, they're very abundant, and so, of course, after 2,000 years, the Romans in the 2nd century A.D. Expelled almost all the Jews out of the region, and they settled in countries around the world. And now, 70 years ago, 1948, the state of Israel, the modern state, was established, and Jews from almost 200 countries around the world, virtually every country in the world, came back to what was then Palestine and to a reborn Israel. And that is at least the story of the millennium, if not farther back than that. So the biggest story going in the world today is the regathering the Jewish exiles into their ancestral land, the naming of the state of Israel as a modern entity, and now that the country is thriving, it's hard to ignore.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the signs that we're living in the end times. And people, we need to keep our eyes on Israel. Israel is or Jerusalem is where God said He would put His name. He made a covenant with Israel, and He's sticking to it. And we can see how all eyes are on Israel, all nations, are threatened by Israel. So we can see that she certainly is a cup of trembling, like the Bible says. Now, when I think of President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, I know that it made a little sense to most Middle East experts, but to Christians, this is huge. And I want to talk a little bit about this. Why? And I know that's why they're honoring Trump, but why is this huge, Jim?
Well, it's the first time that an American president has done so. For the last 50 years, since LBJ was president at the time of the Six-Day War, all American presidents have done sort of a diplomatic dance so that they don't appear to too heavily favor the Israelis. And so the status of Jerusalem has always been considered to be sort of up in the air. And so none of us saw this coming with Trump. Nobody, a year ago, certainly 2 years ago, the idea that an American president would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital was just almost fantasy. His recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital doesn't make sense to secular people because they don't put any stock in the Bible, of course. But to Christians, it's almost on par with the founding of the state in 48 and Six-Day War victory of 67 in terms of momentous events. What it does is it really locks in, Israel's claim to the capital, but that has political consequences too, because the Palestinians claim that they want Jerusalem for a future capital of Palestine. So it fast tracks this tension and this coming to a head of these political agendas. And so again, Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital is absolutely just a staggering event.
Yeah, it's paramount. And I know we didn't talk about this, but I just want to mention to my listeners is that right now, even the Sanhedrin in honor of Trump is putting Trump's picture along with Cyrus's picture engraved on a half silver shekel. And I think that is huge, and I know that this is, I believe, the shekel is used in the temple. We will be talking about that in a few weeks with Bob Mitchell, so please stay tuned for that. That whole idea of why he's getting so much honor on that. And I think that is huge. When I saw that picture, I almost fell over, just to see Trump with Cyrus's picture there. But anyway, in Zechariah 12:2, it reads that, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, and when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah and against Jerusalem." Does this scripture really apply to the heat Netanyahu is taking on all sides? I mean, or is this have nothing to do with it?
Well, I think it probably does have something to do with it, because you're correct that, for me, one of the clearest signs that everything is advancing rapidly in the end times is this intensifying pressure on Israel. And so it's far more likely that a strong Zionist leader like Netanyahu will draw the heat from his enemies more than if there were, say, an Ehud Barak or an Ehud Olmert as prime minister who's not really nearly as far right as Netanyahu. So the fact that you have a strong Zionist as prime minister is driving a lot of this intensifying pressure, and so thus you would say that it is helping fulfill the prophecy.
Yeah, it's absolutely helping fulfill the prophecy. And that's why we have to keep all of our eyes on Israel. It's that important. I do want to move on, Jim. We were going to talk about it in segment 3, but I read your Prophecy Watch article, Hot on the Border, and I know we're going to be talking about that in the next segment. But concerning the threat of Russian presence in Syria and Iranian presence, if you want to begin to share with our audience what is going on there and why is this such an issue right now, and that we should be on the edge of our seats watching what's going on.
Sure. Well, in 2011, the civil war erupted in Syria, and Bashar Assad began to lose his grip on power. And so as Assad began to lose power in Syria, Putin and the Russians intervened because they saw an opportunity to exploit that.
We're going on a break. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned. What is hot on the borders?
Many would agree that we are living in unprecedented times. Grave immorality is on the rise, as in the days of Noah and Sodom and Gomorrah. There are wars and rumors of wars as nations rise against nations. Prophecy is being fulfilled as the birth pangs become quicker and harder. These are the signs of the return of Jesus Christ. There is one sign often left untaught. Jesus also told the disciples in the Olivet Discourse to take heed that no man deceive you. This warning applies to us too. Deception has infiltrated the churches through many false teachings and movements, making apostasy paramount. As contenders of the faith, we do our best to research and discuss these false teachings for you, the listener. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. With us is guest Jim Fletcher. Jim is a member of the Executive Committee of the National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel, and author of It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. He writes online for World Net Daily, Belief Net, American Family Association, and the Jerusalem Post, and Rapture Ready. Jim, there's always something going on near Israel's border, and I know you started to tell us a little bit of what's going on before the break. There's threats, wars, rumors of wars, as the Bible said that we would hear in the last days, particularly in Matthew 24. Again, I had read your Prophecy Watch article, Hot on the Border, concerning the threat of Russian presence in Syria and Iranian presence. Why don't you continue to share with our audience? If you want to backtrack a little bit, that's fine too, as to what is going on there.
Sure. Well, the vacuum of power that has existed since the Syrian civil war started several years ago is the issue. And as President Assad in Syria has gradually lost power, and in fact was very close to being toppled. The Russians moved in, Putin moved in, because they saw an opportunity. The Russians have long wanted to be a player in the Middle East. They've long coveted a warm weather seaport in the region. And so anytime that they can insert themselves into the affairs of one of the Arab states, they will. I mean, remember, a generation ago, they were propping up the Egyptians, the Soviet Union was. And so now in their current entity, they're doing the same thing in Syria. Now, compounding the problem is the fact that now the Iranians are also a presence in Syria, and so it's turned what was a fairly quiet northern border with Israel into a much more dangerous situation with, as I said, Iranian presence of both troops and equipment, and then you have this civil war involving various terror groups, and so it's something that Israel has to constantly monitor on its northern border.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly because really, I mean, I hear from some that Russia and Iran does not have an agenda, and yet you look at this situation, say it seems like they're in cahoots, and because Iran is against Israel, will Russia be against Israel? I mean, I know that they're involved in Syria, but what do you think? Do you think there's an agenda for the two of them to come against Israel?
At this point in time, I think that there is an agenda on the part of the Iranians to at least probe Israel's defenses. I mean, the Iranians want to, at some point, get into a conflict with Israel simply because they are driven by Islamist ideology, and they have their own brand of eschatology and end times stuff, and they feel that they are accomplishing things for Allah and that sort of thing. The Russians are much more secular in their approach, much more pragmatic. For the Russians, it's simply an opportunity to set up bases there, perhaps with an eye in the future at some of the natural gas and oil reserves. But for the present, I think Russia is there just for geopolitical purposes. The Iranians, though, are there for, their own weird religious purposes.
Yeah. And it seems like, like you said, that the Russians were really interested in the warm weather seaports, and
yes.
Yeah. So we can see that happening. But I was just wondering, a lot of people were wondering if there was something going on between the two. Now, I know the Iranians threatening presence in Israel's airspace. We saw that not too long ago. I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, where they had a UAV? Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Come into their airspace, and we didn't hear much of that on the news. So I was wondering if you knew anything else or any more information.
Yeah, the Iranians will, they send a drone into Israeli airspace, which is a real provocation. For 30, 40 years, Israel has dealt with terror groups like Hezbollah and that sort of thing, but they were not terribly sophisticated with their technology. Now, the Iranians are starting to probe with some more advanced weaponry. Now, again, it's sort of a different, two agendas going on here. The Iranians are a little more in your face, a little more saber-rattling, where the Russians, I'm convinced the Russians want no part of any kind of military engagement with Israel. They, Netanyahu and Putin, in fact, have met 6 or 8 times in the last 2 or 3 years. They're coordinating things pretty closely together, I believe. The Iranians, however, as I said earlier, more unstable in their thinking, and they're spoiling for a fight at some point. However, I'm also convinced that when it gets right down to it, neither country, either Russia or the Iranians, want to get into a full-scale war with Israel. It doesn't matter what they say in public. They saber-rattle in public, and they threaten Israel. behind the scenes, it's a different story.
Oh, that's interesting. And you should know because you certainly do a lot of journalism, on the Middle East. Now, we already talked about Iran's and Russia's relationship, but what do you think Russia's trying to do with America right now? I know we didn't talk about that, but it always seems like that Putin is up to no good, or he has another agenda. But what do you think the relationship really is between the United States and Russia, just in your thoughts?
Well, I think the relationship is not good right now. In fact, it's never been really good, even in periods when it appeared that, things were normalizing. Now, one thing that people don't always remember is that the Russians, for the last 90 years, since the Russian Revolution, have wanted to meddle in American affairs. They want to cause destabilization in this country. And so that effort has actually been remarkably stable. Whether you're talking about Lenin and Stalin all the way to Putin, the goal is always the same, to cause America trouble in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it just seems like that they are jealous of America and they just want... I just felt that with them going into Syria, and if I remember correctly, that we were told not to come into their airspace. In other words, stay out of this, and we did. Is that correct?
Yes. Once again, you're talking about the difference between Obama's response and Trump's response.
Yes. Yeah. And so, but I mean, it just seems like Trump really, he gave Putin what he wanted. He basically was like, okay, you take care of this then. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think largely that's the case. The fact is, we don't want to get any more involved in Syria than we have to. Right. And frankly, if there are 3 or 4 or 5 groups fighting among themselves, we're going to be content to let them do that.
Yeah. Well, we're wasting a lot of military money, too, at that point, which we don't need to be doing. Now, we're trying to build our military at this point. We don't really need that. So that's very interesting. Again, we're not hearing the news that we should be hearing, and it's very difficult to find out what's really going on. If you just tuned in, with us is Guest Jim Fletcher. Jim is a member of the Executive Committee of the National Christian Leadership Conference for Israel. He is the author of It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine, and he does write as a journalist for WorldNet Daily, BeliefNet, American Family Association, the Jerusalem Post, and Rapture Ready, as I mentioned before. But this might be a great opportunity, Jim, to talk about your book, End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine.
Well, thanks. It's a book that I was really excited to do because it really is meant for a broader audience than the traditional, Bible prophecy community. I always want to stay in that community. But that book was really written for, it was written for anyone, but it's a book that you could easily put into the hands of a college student, and I think they would begin to understand Bible prophecy.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Now, where can one get your book?
Amazon, all over, really, bookstores, online.
Okay. And that's The End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. And, I have to say, Jim, is that I need to get a hold of your book, too. And after I do, we'll do another show on it, just on that book alone.
That sounds great.
That sounds great. I'm excited about that. So what else, Jim, should we know as Christians when it comes to the Mideast?
Well, that there are a lot of, for the first time, there are a lot of different issues coming together, a lot of things on the table at the same time. Mm-hmm. One of them that's new is this whole-scale persecution of Christians in the Middle East. That's a story that Christians in the West really don't understand very well. But the fact is that Islamic persecution of Christians is a huge story, and one that we really need to be engaged in. So, a lot of different things going on all at the same time, but as always, the focal point of Bible prophecy is always going to be what's happening to Israel.
Yeah, to Israel, and what's happening to the Christians, around the world. Yes. And you're right, we don't hear that on our news. We should. So when we get a minute, folks, just pray for these people that are persecuted. We don't know persecution in America. I don't know if we ever will. I hope we don't. But if we do, I would think that it would be a shock to our culture here, and that we need to get ready, not only for the Lord's return, but to make a stand for what we believe. And we believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, and we need to stand up for that truth and everything that is mentioned in the Bible, because he is the Word that became flesh and dwelt among us. So when we read the Word of God, we read the Bible, we're reading about God's Son, Jesus Christ, and who God the Father is. So anything else you want to add, Jim? We have a break coming up soon, so if you want to add something, that'd be great.
Well, I think we've covered quite a bit of ground.
Okay.
I think we're good for now.
All right, we're good. We're going on a break. We'll be back with our last segment, God's Miraculous Hand on Israel. So please stay tuned.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, we read that men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, without self-control, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. They will be ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Thank you for having a love for the truth.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host for Love for the Truth Radio. And with us, we have Jim Fletcher. He's the author of It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. Please check that out on Amazon. That's It's the End of the World as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. In reference to reading your quote, everyone knows about the mega-rich natural gas Israel recently found in the Mediterranean, and now 2 to 3 countries dispute who owns that. I forget where I read that, to be honest with you. I know I was reading so many of your articles and listening to some of your sermons online, but this will continue to bring Russia into the mix. I know we talked a little bit about that, and for the longest, Bible prophecy experts have long speculated over what would prompt the hook in Gog's jaw to bring him and his massive coalition army to bear on Israel. Now, we know that natural riches would seem to be a plausible catalyst for Gog and Magog. So this is another development worth watching. Now, when it comes to the Gog and Magog war, we did have Nathan Jones on our show, and he's an avid, researcher as far as understanding the Gog and Magog war. I don't understand it, to be perfectly honest with you, but I was just wondering if what's going on right now, with the natural gas that Israel recently found in the Mediterranean, and now there's a dispute who owns it. Do you think this would be a catalyst for that war?
It very well could be. I'm often cautious about the timing of the Gog-Magog war, the famous chapters 38, 39 in Ezekiel, where it's describing a coalition army that moves against Israel, and it's under the direction of someone called Gog. Now, the description in the passages seems to indicate that this is Russia that leads this attack. But the thing that makes your question relevant is the fact that Israel, a couple of years ago, found a huge natural gas field in the Mediterranean within their waters, maybe worth $1 trillion. This is the first time that Israel's had large-scale natural resources that someone else would covet. And the fact is that in the Gog-Magog passages in Ezekiel, it talks about Gog coming to take a spoil. And so, again, this is the first time that there would be something tangible that would be valuable in terms of money that the Russians might want. So it is very possible that we're seeing the outlines of this develop.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And to think that there's 2 or 3 countries in dispute over who owns it or who owns what. But what's interesting with Ezekiel 38 and 39 is that, not many people know the timeline on the Gog and Magog war. It just seems like there's so many different views on that. Do you think this is the right timing for the Gog and Magog war?
Again, it could be, and the reason I say it could be is because, and if I can say it this way, one of the traps that Bible prophecy students sometimes fall into is being too rigid with timelines. In other words, something happens, and so this means that it's now in play. Also, the chronology of things. There's arguments whether Armageddon is after Gog Magog or if it's the same event and that sort of thing. Very honestly, I don't know that that's the most important question. The issue is that we understand what the event is supposed to be, so when it does happen in the future and we're still here to see it, we'll understand what's happening. That, I think, is the important part.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to understand prophecy, or at least to seek it out, because I know there's a lot of churches today that and a lot of belief that we shouldn't be really involved in prophecy. It doesn't matter, just be ready, But yet we know that God has given us prophecies to warn us of His return and to get us ready so that we can prepare. What are your thoughts on that, Jim?
I absolutely agree. I think you make a superb point because, maybe 35% of the entire Bible is prophecy, and so for some of these churches, in this is becoming unfortunately more popular to ignore prophecy. For them to ignore that much of the Bible is really a detriment to their own congregations. Prophecy has never been more relevant than it is right now.
That's right.
And so if you're in a church that isn't teaching it, you're really, really missing out.
Yeah, well, let me just say this, is I've been a Christian for 40 years, I'm telling my age here, and I don't remember ever hearing a message or a sermon on prophecy, except when I first came to the Lord in 1977. Okay, and I had a pastor come to our house for a Bible study, and he taught us all about, no, I'm sorry, that was in 78, all about Revelation. And that's where I heard the most. Until this day, I remember everything that pastor had said, and I'm watching it come to fruition. So it's amazing some of the things that he talked about. I don't even know how he knew, what was going to take place. But boy, he just pinpointed everything, even from like the smaller banks were going to sell out to the bigger banks, and you'll see a CVS on every corner, and hospitals. I mean, like, he just had it down to all the details. And I don't know how he even got that out of Revelation, but I'll tell you what, it impacted my life and gave me to a point, got me to a point personally that I needed to always be ready and to be watchful and to fulfill the mission and the calling that God had on my life, and to be serious about it and intentional. So anyway, why don't we discuss God's miraculous protection over Israel, Jim, so our listeners can clearly see God's covenant in fruition. And that's the reason why I want to talk about this, is because, I don't want people to feel like, things are happening and prophecy is being fulfilled, and then fear comes in. But we have to know that when we are in a relationship with the Lord, just as much as He's in covenant with Israel and it's coming to fruition, how we also are in covenant with the Lord, and that, we do have His hand of protection, and He is El Shaddai. I'm sorry, I'm fumbling here, but El Shaddai, all-sufficient God, and that we can depend on Him even during the darkest hours.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is the point. That really is the point. It's not so much that, that we can fit current events into certain timelines and things like that. It's the idea that God has, and this is historically documented, don't take my word for it, God has provided for the Jewish people, especially in modern times, in miraculous ways, time after time. And so, if we see Him working in the lives of individual Jews and in the collective life of the nation Israel, then it seems to me that it's easy to see that he's also capable of taking care of us as individuals. And so that really is the point. When you consider that in all of Israel's modern wars, they could have been either annihilated or severely crippled, and they weren't, and in fact won all those wars in miraculous fashion, you can't explain that apart from supernatural intervention.
Right.
And so again, if we're watching these things happen to Israel, we should be able to tell ourselves as individuals that the same God who protects them will protect me.
Yeah, absolutely, and amen to that. I mean, I think of the 6-Day War. That was a miraculous event. I don't know what the numbers were, if you know the numbers off the top of your head of what Israel was dealing with at that time. But here was this little country, as big as New Jersey is in America, and here they had won the war. So, I mean, that's an event, a miraculous event in and of itself.
Yes, in fact, if someone wanted to read just the history of the 6-Day War, you almost could come to an understanding of who God is just by reading that history. It's one of the most astonishing stories of all time, and they're just they literally won the war in 6 days against 5 invading Arab armies. You can't make that stuff up. It's at every point in the war, something miraculous happened to help Israel, and it's an amazing story.
It is an amazing story. So if you want to teach your kids anything, it might be a good idea to check out the history of Israel's 6-Day War, and then explain to your children that God, watches over us and protects us in miraculous ways too. I think that's great. I think I'll do that with my grandkids. I just came up with the idea right now. So what should we continue to be watching? I know that you write a lot, Jim, about the Mideast. I know there's probably so much more that's going on that we did not discuss, but what else should our listeners be watching right now?
Well, I think the key thing is something we've touched on tonight, and that is continue watching what is going on with the status of Jerusalem. Because there are prophecies in the Old Testament, particularly in Zechariah, that tell us that Jerusalem will be the focal point of a great end times battle. Continue watching to see what happens there, because the more that the Israelis strengthen their claim on the city, the more their global enemies, including the Palestinians, will become upset. And we know from reading Zechariah that at some point that's going to spill over into an all-out war. So again, the status of Jerusalem is really key to everything accelerating in the very last of the last days.
Yeah, I mean, and then we think about even the third temple having to be built, and we have the Temple Institute getting everything ready, and yet we still don't know exactly where they're going to be building this temple. I know you and I didn't talk about this, but I mean, when you look at that in and of itself, of that there is a preparation of that being ready to be built, I mean, they have almost all their instruments, right?
They do, and it's also another interesting thing about that. It spills over into the political realm as well, because it's not well known, but there have been Israeli prime ministers who are aware of the work of people like the Temple Mount Institute, and I think help them sometimes behind the scenes when they can. So that the rebuilding of the temple is a reality to the people of Israel.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And I think when I see the development again and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, I just wonder if that is going to really start an all-out war, especially, or even, making Jerusalem the capital of Israel. And I think what I understand is that the Palestinians want, is it the west side of Jerusalem to be their capital?
It's actually the east.
Or the east, okay.
It's really, a two-part thing. The Palestinians publicly claim that they want East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine.
Okay.
But in fact, they're not. They don't really hide the fact that they want the whole country. Mm-hmm. They will say publicly they want half of the city. They really want all of the city. Mm-hmm. And so, no matter what Israel does, the Palestinians will not be satisfied. And so that continuing struggle and tension over the city itself, and getting down specifically to the Temple Mount itself, mm-hmm. there's the flashpoint for everything that's going to come.
Yeah, that's it. And, when we look back in history, biblical history, we see that this is the division, really, of Ishmael and Isaac. We don't have time to talk about that. We've talked about that on other shows, but we are going on a break. We will be back with Jim Fletcher, and he'll give us his final advice. So please stay tuned.
You're listening to Love for the Truth Radio. We'll be right back, so please stay tuned.
Welcome back. I'm Cindy Hartline, your host for Love for the Truth Radio Philadelphia. Look us up on loveforthetruthradio.com. We air programs via stream every day. You can find program archives with contributors John Haller, Chris Quintana, Carl Tykrib, Patrick Wood, guests like Bill Koenig, Ray Youngin, Johanna Michelson, Bill Salas, and Jan Markell, and many more veterans of the faith with the voice of truth. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, and on Rapture Ready Radio on Monday evenings on Blog Talk Radio with Jackie Alnor, along with numerous web radio programs who air us on their stations worldwide. Welcome back. We're in our last segment, and Jim Fletcher, our guest, will give us his final advice for our listeners. Jim, and also if you want to give your contact information where somebody can get in touch with you, that would be great.
Okay, great. Well, in terms of advice, a couple of things. I think that the timing has never been better to educate people about Bible prophecy. And in particular, we all have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. The millennial generation is really in need of good instruction about Bible prophecy. So wherever you are, and in whatever way you can, make that sort of your ministry, to teach them about Bible prophecy. The other thing is to really continue to intensify our prayers for the peace of Jerusalem. And I would also add that we should pray for the Palestinian people themselves, the Arab people. They, they're human beings made in the image of God, and sometimes we consider them to be the enemy when I think, in fact, it's their leadership. So prayer and education about prophecy. In terms of how to reach me, prophecymatters.com is the website. Also, the blogs that you mentioned, in particular, my Rapture Ready weekly column, Israel Watch, is one I've been doing for about 10 years now, and I have contact info there as well.
Thank you, Jim, so much for all of your information. Thank you, audience, for listening. We'll see you next week. God bless.